There is no actual physical injury, is there, other than some bruising? I am not suggesting that bruising is nice, but there's no disfigurement. There are no broken bones. There are no serious physical injuries, are there? Those words were spoken by criminal court judge Lorin Duckman at a bail hearing for the man who had been relentlessly stalking and abusing Galina Komar. Galina was present in the courtroom that day, forced to listen as the severity of what had been done to her was minimized. At one point, she would note that the judge was more concerned about the placement of her stalker's dog than he was about her life. And 3 weeks later, she would be dead. With January marking National Stalking Awareness Month, this episode does not only revisit the injustice of Galina's case, it examines the ripple effects her murder had across New York City, exposing deep failures in how stalking and domestic violence were treated at the time. Galina's death set off political infighting at the highest levels, and as the debate played out, a grim pattern continued to emerge. Women being targeted by former partners kept getting killed. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on my regular episodes of A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This episode is a little bit different than my typical episodes because we know who the stalker is and we know how the story ends. But stalking is something that nearly 1 in 3 American women and 1 in 6 American men will experience in their lifetime. Stalking has shifted over time, the methodology often looks different, and laws in each state have kept on developing, constantly playing catch-up with risk and reality. And so for this episode, I wanted to pivot and tell you about this tragic case from 1996 and some of the things that we learned from it. This week, I'm bringing to you the murder of Galina Komar. Galina Komar was deeply loved. She was a cherished daughter, a devoted mother to her 5-year-old daughter, and an immigrant who created a rich and connected life within her New York City community. She was a friend, a professional, and someone who worked hard for the life she was building. And these were just some of the many roles that defined her life. Galina had been married once before, and that man was the father of her little girl, Tatiana. After they split, Galina was working at the New Rochelle Lincoln Mercury dealership, and it was there that she first bumped into a man that caught her attention. His name was Benito Oliver, and he worked installing car alarms. The two hit it off. To Galina, it was kind of a rebound relationship where she was putting feelers out there and getting back out there as a single mom after a divorce. But to Benito Oliver, it was much more serious. Benito Oliver came on intensely at the start of the relationship. He put Galina up on a pedestal, showered her with affection, made grand romantic gestures, and talked openly about their future together. He made her feel seen, cherished, and deeply loved. Today, we have a clear name for that pattern, and we talk about it much more openly than we did in the 1990s. It's called love bombing, and love bombing is a form of manipulation where someone overwhelms a partner with excessive affection, attention, praise, gifts, or promises very early on, with the end goal of creating emotional dependence and gaining control. And then what often follows is a sharp shift. The constant affection fades, the warmth is replaced with distance, moodiness, withdrawal. And the person on the receiving end is left confused, scrambling to get things back to the way they were, feeling this urgent need to fix what they think they've done wrong. Galina didn't know that Benito Oliver had a long history of abusive behavior towards women. As we know now, in the modern dating world, it's not all that uncommon, at the very least, to Google a person or scroll back through their old social media if you can find it to try to get a sense of them. I mean, all the way up to now, you can background check somebody as an ordinary citizen. But it just wasn't like that in 1996. So let's take a moment to rewind and look back at Oliver, a perspective that Galina wasn't privy to. Benito Oliver was convicted as a juvenile for rape back in 1976. In the late 80s, he served time in jail for drug and assault charges. People around him, even his landlord, said he was a violent man with a hot temper and a short fuse. He had exes who talked of his disturbing behavior in relationships. One such ex was a woman interviewed by the Daily News. Her name was Anne-Marie LeBlanc, and she was a postal worker in New Rochelle, New York. She met and began dating Benito Oliver in 1992. She said he was funny, witty, and liked to take her out to special dinners. He was transparent with her about his criminal history, but he chalked it up to being young and in a chapter of his life that he had put behind him. He had goals. She said he wanted to be a cop and that he had a daughter from a previous relationship whom he was trying to step up and do better for. So even though he didn't have a job, Anne-Marie took him up on his offer for her to move in with him because she felt like it was just a temporary circumstance and that he was a guy trying to turn his life around. After Anne-Marie moved in with Benito Oliver, his demeanor shifted. He began getting jealous of her and isolating her. He first hit her in December of 1983. She recalled that reflexively she just hit him back, and that it infuriated him so much he just began beating on her. She went to police, but ultimately decided not to press charges or get an order of protection. Being a mail carrier who worked alone walking the streets, she was worried about him retaliating and harming her further. She felt that if she angered him, her life was in more danger. Anne-Marie began to step outside of her situation and gain perspective on her relationship when she began taking a women's psychology class at college. She realized that Oliver had been manipulative to her and just how badly it was that she needed to leave the situation. She quietly began setting aside money and saved enough for a security deposit. She then grabbed her things and left. Galina Komar entered the picture with what seems like somewhat of an overlap time frame with Anne-Marie based on the dates I found in local papers. And that new fixation on Galina may have been the only thing that separated his obsession from Anne-Marie. After Galina moved in with Benito Oliver, she experienced the same things that Anne-Marie and others before her had. Galina began reporting to work at the car dealership with bruises, black eyes, and parts of her body noticeably covered. Her disposition changed, and while she continued to do award-winning work, those who knew her best noticed she was beginning to seem like a shell of who she once was. Benito's abuse continued to escalate, and Galina's mother, Asia, began keeping a log of his abusive incidents towards her daughter. On February 21st, 1995, she wrote, 22 stitches in the forehead and broken lip. He beat her with a vacuum cleaner hose. She asked him to bring her to the hospital, but he said no. So she promised not to tell what happened. The surgeon asked her, but she said she hit her head on the table. After this incident, Galina walked into work and resigned from her position. She couldn't take what Oliver was putting her through, and when he wasn't home, she grabbed Tatiana and escaped to California to try to get away from him. She felt the only way she could be safe was having physical distance. But it wouldn't take long for Oliver to track her down. We will never know what was said, but we do know that Galina made her way back to the East Coast and placed Tatiana in the custody of her mother, Asia, moving into Oliver's apartment in Old Bridge, New Jersey. On April 29, 1995, Galina's mother, Asia, wrote one line in her journal. He said he wants to cut her throat. On July 24th, 1995, Asia wrote, "He did not let Galina come home to see the baby. I need her to bring food. I can't feed the baby. She wanted to come home, but he said to her, 'If you don't sit down in the car, I'll kill you. I'm the boss.'" And things just kept getting worse. July 28th, 1995, just a few days later, she wrote, "He keeps motioning with his finger across his throat like he's going to slash her neck." The next day, she said, "He said, 'I don't have a job. I have nothing to lose. I'm going to kill myself and everybody.'" August 2nd, 1995. "He has taken Galina's car keys and keeps her home like a prisoner. He won't let her call me." August 8th, 1995, he said to her, quote, "If you go and see your mother, it's going to be a Nicole Simpson night," alluding to the extremely high-profile murder of Nicole Brown Simpson that had dominated the news in the year prior. Shortly thereafter, Benito Oliver would assault Galina again and brandish a knife, waving it at her. She called police in Old Bridge, and they arrested Oliver and issued Galina an order of protection. But as it comes time to get to court, Galina becomes fearful once again. Asia documented in her journal on August 26th of 95, he tells her to tell the judge, "Tell him you love me and I love you, and it's not going to happen again." Galina dropped those charges. Hearing this, you may be having complicated feelings on that decision. But for people navigating intimate partner violence, one thing that happens is that you become an excellent risk assessor, and there are so many complications. The worry of risk in retaliation or an escalation of violence. And mind you, Benito Oliver told Galina on multiple occasions that if she ever told police, followed through, got restraining orders, he would not only kill her, he would kill her daughter and her mother. Shortly after this, the couple moved back to New Rochelle again, but this time Galina was hatching a plan with friends and family. She just knew she couldn't keep living like this, and so she enlisted the help of several close friends and her mother Asia, and she moved back to Brooklyn with her mom and was reunited and living again with her daughter. This enraged Benito Oliver. On November 3rd of 1995, Asia wrote in her journal, "He's come to my home and he said he will kill my daughter, me, and my granddaughter." A week later, on the 10th, she wrote, "He hit her in the face, in the nose, and he told her, 'I'll kill you and your mother effing mother.'" November 28th of 95, she wrote that he gave her bruises to her left arm for no reason. Oliver continued to follow, call, harass, and show up to Asia's home, trying to just get in touch with Galina, showing up at her workplace. Then things boiled over on December 15th of 1995. Oliver attacked Galina and beat her up and pulled a large butcher knife on her, threatening her with it. Police were called and Oliver was arrested, with a same-day order of protection issued. Even though the order of protection barred Oliver from contacting her at all, he called her 3 times from prison that same day. Asia documented that one time he called demanding she cover his $500 in rent. Later transcripts would reveal he also began obsessing over his dog. Galina had arranged for care of his dog and had given the dog to the person who was going to care for it indefinitely while Benito Oliver was in jail, which I think was super kind of her because it's really not her problem. But she knows it's not the dog's fault that the owner is a horrible person, so she stepped up and tried to help out. Oliver began threatening her, saying, "Give me my dog back. If you don't give me my dog back, you'll be sorry." All sorts of stuff like that. Oliver's first bail hearing was December 27th, and his aunt raised $2,000 to bail him out. You know, enabling and all. But upon being bailed out, he was immediately rearrested and charged with violating the order of protection by phoning Galina and harassing her from jail. Over the next few weeks, Galina would find herself in the middle of a battle of egos between the prosecution and the presiding Brooklyn criminal court judges in the case. According to court records obtained by the Daily News, the first bail hearing after the rearrest was on January 2nd, 1996. The judge on that date was Eugene Schwartzwald. Eugene Schwartzwald started by saying, "I am resetting the new bail at $2,500. The defense attorney said, "Your Honor, I would like to move for a more reasonable bail." And then Judge Schwartzwald said that he was concerned about the idea of him going back out and repeating this behavior towards Galina. The defense attorney didn't really address that. They just said, well, he's employed and he will lose his job and he has dependents to support. And Schwartzwald said he should have thought of that. He should have thought about his job before he bothered that woman again. And then a little while later, after reviewing his record, he said, "I am looking at your record, and your record is actually a terrible record. In fact, as I look at it now, I'm going to make your bail on the old case $5,000. So Judge Schwartzwald saw the writing on the wall, knew this man was dangerous, and he set his bail at $5,000, saying there's no way he should be out before trial. And so at this point, things are looking promising. But then they take a turn. On January 24th, 1995, the next hearing for Oliver, Galina Komar bravely faced her abuser in the courtroom as the case was presided over by criminal court judge Lorin Duckman, and he came in hot. Duckman said, quote, "He has been in jail enough for a person who is charged with these crimes. I want to know about the dog." Then, as he's explaining his rationale of why he really wants to wipe the slate clean, so to speak, in a lot of ways for Benito Oliver, he says, "My feeling was that if one of the reasons there was an animus between Mr. Oliver and Miss Komar was the dog, that by getting the dog back to Mr. Oliver, that would eliminate one of the problems. We have had to do a great deal towards assuring the safety of Miss Komar, as well as putting the dog back into the hands of somebody who can actually care for the dog, because I didn't want anything to happen to the dog either." He then said, "The return of the dog to him or to his family will assure there is no further violence in this case." Prosecutor Patria Frias Colon countered that the prior history between the two in this case shows that this is not about the dog, and she argued that she was highly concerned for the safety of Galina if he was released before the trial. I, of course, agree with the prosecutor here, and there is so much wrong with what the judge was saying. First of all, by saying, give the dog back to him or his family, he's already highlighting that there is an option for the dog to be with one of his relatives that doesn't include his release from prison. Second, Benito Oliver shouldn't get to call the shots here and have everyone catering to what is going to set him off or not. The judge should not be all like, well, I bet getting his dog back will keep him from losing his mind. No, that right there shows you he is violent and has no business being out. Duckman went on to say, why should he still be in jail on these cases in light of the fact that, one, he wants to go to Pennsylvania and stay away from her, and two, there is no mandatory imprisonment in this case. He then launched into the quote that I said at the top of this episode, that there's no actual physical injury, really, just some bruises. And it's not that bruises are nice, but there's no disfigurement. There's no broken bones. Just absolute sick, that belief. It's just rooted in such toxic mentality. In some final thoughts to make your blood boil, he accused the prosecution of over-exaggerating details of Galina Komar's beating to keep Oliver behind bars. And he said that the previous judges only raised the bail because they had previously had instances of being too lenient and it turning out poorly, so they were just covering themselves and not actually rationally evaluating the case. And again, in my opinion, Duckman, you just said the quiet part out loud. Like, if those judges learned because they had previously been too lenient and bad things had happened, that's not them overreacting. That's them learning from previous mistakes they had made, the mistake you're about to make. As a result, he not only did not enforce the $5,000 bail set forth by the previous judge, he waived bail altogether. And he placed limitations on her order of protection, saying that Oliver could only be arrested for violating the order of protection if law enforcement officers witnessed Oliver in Komar's presence. If you're angry, so am I. In a society that says, why don't women just leave? Why don't they turn to the court system? Literally this is why. That judge just said, I don't believe you unless a law enforcement officer witnesses it. Still on his misogynistic power trip, Duckman dismissed the uproar of the prosecution, saying, quote, I have calmly, coolly, and dispassionately evaluated all the facts. I did what I was going to do. Do I want to hear anything more about it? Because all you are doing right now is just making things up. I don't want to hear about his prior record. I don't want to hear about his prior acts of violence. I don't want to hear about the relationship between them. Is there something I haven't heard before? I don't believe that there is that degree of fear and danger that you say should be covered by this order of protection. So, Benito Oliver got out of jail. He immediately began contacting Galina. In early February, he showed up to her new place of work, Copel Volkswagen in Queens, New York, violating the order of protection. She had made her coworkers aware, and they quickly spotted him and threw him out. Because a law enforcement officer had not witnessed it, per the new rules set forth by Judge Duckman, who it's taking everything in me not to twist his last name into a much more suitable nickname that reflects his character. Because of that, he just walked out. Around the same time, Galina got a call back to be enrolled into a brand new program. It was a domestic violence program sponsored by District Attorney Charles Hines. In partnership with ADT Security Systems, those who were accepted into the program were those who police determined to have the most safety risk. They were given a pendant to wear around their neck that served as a panic button, and it would immediately summon police. It primarily worked within their home and had a short range, but the thought was that it could at least keep people more safe in their own homes where they were most at risk. So Galina did get one of those in early 1996. On Sunday, February 11th, Galina's mother, Asia, wrote in her tracking journal that she told Galina not to go to work on Monday, that Benito would show up again and harass her. And she responded, Mom, who is going to feed the baby if I don't go to work? And so, on Monday, February 12th, 1996, Benito Oliver entered the car dealership through the back door and headed straight to Galina's office. Armed with a .44 caliber revolver, Oliver gunned down Galina, killing her instantly, and then turned the gun on himself. The shooting made waves quickly, and the car dealership where Galina worked was owned by a friend and donor to Mayor Rudy Giuliani. At the time, Rudy Giuliani was only in his second year as New York City mayor, and when he heard about the shooting, he rushed down to check on his friend. The dealership's owner was right next door, sharing a wall with Galina's office. It was then that the owner, Mr. Copel, shared with Rudy Giuliani about the ongoing violence and stalking behavior that Galina had been on the receiving end of, and the decision to let out her stalker free of bail and with a reduced order of protection weeks earlier. Giuliani, along with New York State Governor George Pataki, vowed to bench Judge Duckman, and the New York City newspapers were all over it. Duckman's face was all over the front pages, saying things like not fit to judge and Duckman ducking out, in response to him cashing in on his large stash of PTO to vacation with his wife immediately after. Duckman was rather blasé about Komar's death, essentially saying it's tragic, but this happens sometimes as a judge and you can't always weigh in correctly. Governor George Pataki said, quote, "It is clear that there was a real risk of violence against this woman, and I don't believe the judge acted properly in weighing that risk of violence. We have to take a hard look at whether Brooklyn criminal court judge Lorin Duckman should be allowed to continue to serve. It's a disgrace that someone with this violent history, who had made overt threats, in fact battered this poor woman in the past, was allowed on the street," end quote. Around the 28th or 29th of that month, Pataki demanded that Duckman be removed from his position. But this would not be an immediate thing because the chief administrative judge would not remove Duckman, saying it would be inappropriate to do so based on one poor decision, and instead suggested that Lorin Duckman be switched into a new position in the, quote, normal course of judicial rotation. But it didn't end there. The controversy surrounding this case triggered a look back on some of Duckman's other cases. In one instance, a man had been charged with attempted murder for slashing a man's face and neck with a beer bottle during a street fight. The prosecution had requested the bail be set at $50,000, and Duckman made it $750,000, saying he couldn't guarantee it wasn't an accident and cited that the victim was still in the hospital, so he didn't actually even need an order of protection. In another case that was reported on by the Daily News, prosecutors had talked about a time where Duckman scared the parents of somebody who was struggling with substance use disorder and it was facing potential jail time for drug possession. And he called the parents in the back room saying, "Do you want your son to go to jail?" And then in the meantime, the prosecution had said, "Hey, he's actually, we found this plea we've identified. He's willing to do a drug treatment program in lieu of jail time. So I think that would be best for him because, that's actually treating the systemic issue here." And he said no. He just waived it altogether, sent him back out there. He then got rearrested on drug charges. And then after that, he got put in jail for a 2 to 6 year sentence. So that was something where waiving his bail and just releasing him back to the streets when prosecution was ready to say, "Hey, let's do this plea where he actually gets treatment, mandated treatment." No. So that was another one. On June 5th, 1996, the State Commission on Judicial Conduct filed a formal written complaint against Duckman, saying that he willfully disregarded criminal procedural rules, showed an intemperate demeanor, abused judicial power, and showed bias against prosecutors. On November 6th of 96, hearings began before a referee and continued on for weeks with extensive testimony and transcripts. Galina's mother, Asia, blamed him for her daughter's murder and would always show up when she was able to with photos of Galina. She would talk about how her granddaughter would ask for her mother and how she was robbed of time with her. It's important to remember that this review was inspired by the controversy surrounding Galina's murder, but that the review was prompted in response to other misconduct after they dug in further beyond Galina's murder. So 2 years after the murder in July of 98, New York's highest court ruled that Duckman had repeatedly disregarded the law and abused judicial authority, and he was removed from the bench. Duckman had other opinions on the case. In multiple articles, he references how he had aspirations to be on the Supreme Court, that there was political movement related to how they handled this. And also from his perspective, everything changed after Galina Komar's murder, not because of misconduct in that specific case, but because it did create somewhat of a political and media crisis that he says demanded a target or someone to blame. From Duckman's point of view, what followed Galina Komar's murder was not a measured review of judicial conduct, but a political chain reaction already set in motion. He maintained that his bail decision in her stalker's case was lawful and discretionary, and importantly again, that it was ultimately never cited as misconduct. Duckman also argued that the case stalled because of the prosecution. He said that if the prosecutors had moved the case forward faster, it could have gone to trial before Galina was killed. And it had been scheduled to do so, but prosecution said they needed more time. So that's what prompted that whole hearing, which waived his bail. So that was at that point when he said, "I don't see a reason to keep this man in jail in the meantime." And it was, in his viewpoint, that delay, not his bail decision, was what allowed her abuser to remain free. Still, he said, once the tabloids got a hold of it, and elected officials publicly pointed him as the reason Galina was dead, that a narrative had already taken hold before any formal investigation could begin, so it couldn't be unbiased. Duckman argued that once public blame was assigned, that the outcome of that look back was inevitable. He believed that he became a symbol in a moment when the city needed someone to answer for fear, grief, and outrage. And in the weeks following the murder, high-ranking politicians openly demanded his removal, creating pressure that In Duckman's view, the judicial discipline system could not realistically ignore, and to him, the investigation that followed felt less like neutral oversight and more like a search for justification after the decision to remove him had already been made. He also pointed to the scope of his career. He said that he had presided over tens and thousands of cases in some of the busiest criminal courts in New York, yet only a small number of mostly misdemeanor cases were pulled apart years later, many of which he said were only pulled apart in this instance. They were never formally appealed or complained about at the time. He believed those cases were resurrected not because they suddenly mattered, but because they could be used to build a record once he had fallen out of favor. He did acknowledge that he could be sharp. Some of his remarks, he would say, were inappropriate and that some dismissals did not follow procedure to the letter, but he consistently framed his actions as motivated by compassion and a desire to prevent what he saw as unjust or weak prosecutions in an overwhelmed system. In his mind, removal from the bench was not any form of accountability. It was a warning shot, not just to him, but to any judge who dared to make an unpopular call. Now, again, this next part is just my opinion. I believe some of what Duckman said may have some truth to it, but I take issue with him playing the victim and looking for public sympathy when the direct result of his decision put Galina in harm's way. The next court date was supposed to be a week after Galina's murder. If Duckman had not waived the bail and released him upon waiting for the actual next hearing, he wouldn't have even been out in that February day to commit the murder. And I know what he's saying is that while I gave the opportunity for the prosecution to prepare the case, which would have started the trial, which would have waived this altogether, and yes, I see that, but you still had the power to keep him in jail and you didn't, and essentially didn't just to get in kind of a match with the prosecution, a match of egos. Galina's case was a tragic and disturbing example of what can go wrong in cases of stalking and intimate partner violence. And in that same year, New York City had cases like this, one after the other. In memory of the victims and to raise awareness, I'd like to share snippets of their stories to emphasize more of the barriers of the system, some that were more prevalent back in the 90s, and some that still stand the test of time today. Just a month before Galina Komar's death, NYPD officer Kimberly Rivera was struggling with stalking from her ex-husband, John Rivera. He had been violent, stolen her gun months prior, and she had an order of protection. Unfortunately, that order of protection did not apply to custody handoffs, and he still had visitation of their infant son. In January of 1996, she was shot dead in her car with her own gun, while her infant was strapped in the back seat. She had just gotten to her ex's house to pick the baby up. John tried to frame it as a suicide, but was eventually charged in her death. He was found guilty of second-degree depraved indifference murder and sentenced to 23 years to life in prison, where he still remains to this day. In March, another woman would be dead. In the months leading up to the attack, Marco Luciano said that he would kill his ex-wife, Lisa Luciano. He had beaten her many times, she had an order of protection against him, and on Wednesday, March 15th of 1996, neighbors watched as Luciano paced back and forth in front of his estranged wife's apartment, waiting for her to come back from her computer class. She spotted him and was able to make it into her apartment and lock up. She called her brother to come over, but somehow he gained entry into her apartment and repeatedly stabbed her and her brother in front of their small children. Her brother would survive the attack, but Lisa Luciano would not. The Lucianos had been split for 3 years at this point, but Marco continued to stalk Lisa and beat her in front of their children. And his slaps on the wrist for his actions are just unimaginable. For example, Lisa Luciano had called police January 4th of 1994 because her husband had struck her in the head, left arm, and right leg with a broom handle. He was charged with assault, weapons possession, and harassment, which if you had all those charges, they were punishable up to a year in jail. But he pleaded guilty to harassment, and by just doing that and pleading out, he avoided jail time. Harassment was considered a misdemeanor punishable by a maximum of 15 days in jail at the time. Lisa Luciano was also granted a 1-year order of protection at the time, which was supposed to last through January 31st, 1995. But he, of course, didn't follow it. And on April 6th of 94, just 3 months later, Marco Luciano was arrested for kicking Lisa in the left arm and stomach. He was again charged with assault. He was charged with contempt of court for violating the order of protection. And each charge carried a maximum sentence of a year in jail. But for whatever reason, he was allowed to plead out again for just harassment and walk free. And she just got an extended order of protection, and Luciano was mandated to attend counseling. Counseling he didn't do, and prosecutors said, hey, he should at least have to spend the 15 days in jail that comes with not doing that, and nobody followed up. In February of 96, he attacked her again and kicked out her front tooth. It's unclear what came of that, and clearly nothing much because we know he was out to kill her when he was. After that, Lisa's father spent every night at her apartment protecting her, and Marco Luciano waited until the family went to Puerto Rico, and that's when he struck. That just proved that he had been stalking her all along and waiting for when her father wasn't there. Then there was another case in May of 1996 when 45-year-old Sarah Valdez of Long Island was trying to safely leave her husband, print shop worker Pedro Valdez. According to court records, their sons were 11 and 21, and they had attested to the fact that Pedro had been violent towards Sarah for years. Just hours before her murder, Sarah obtained an order of protection from Pedro. It barred him from making contact with her, but it did not prevent him from living in their home, so there were major logistical limitations to say the least. That night, he stabbed her repeatedly as she lay on the couch, as their 11-year-old son slept one room over. She was found dead by her 21-year-old son when he got home. Pedro then drove his car into the woods and hanged himself. In July of 1996, Michelle Richter was trying to leave her stormy 1-year marriage to 23-year-old Stephen Richter. After ongoing abuse, she had obtained a temporary order of protection against her estranged husband 5 days prior. He then pulled up to the deli she worked at, walked in, pointed a rifle at her, and shot her to death before turning the gun on himself. In August, Eva Rosenthal's estranged boyfriend, Ralph Santos, attacked her after she got off the subway train and was taking the escalator back up. He stabbed her once in the chest, killing her, as she had the order of protection still on her in her purse. Rosenthal and Santos had been together for over 20 years and had an adult child together. He abused her and was incredibly violent. From the time she left him until he killed her, he followed her around town, got on buses and trains she was riding, and threatened to kill her. And in the end, he did. He was convicted of second-degree murder. In closing, I wanted to end with a few pieces of information courtesy of nationalstalkingawareness.org. Because what happened to Galina Komar was tragic, and we can do more to prevent things like this from happening, and we still have a long ways to go. So stalkers use many tactics, including making unwanted phone calls, approaching the victim, or showing up in places when the victim does not want them to, following and watching the victim, sending unwanted texts, photos, emails, and messages through social media, and sending unwanted gifts. They also may use technology to monitor, track, or spy on the victim. Almost half of stalking victims experience at least one unwanted contact per week. and 11% of stalking victims have been stalked for 5 years or more. More than twice as many victims are stalked with technology than without. 46% of stalking victims fear not knowing what will happen next. 29% of stalking victims fear it will never stop. 1 in 8 employed stalking victims lose time from work as a result of their victimization, and more than half lose 5 days of work or more. 1 in 7 stalking victims move as a result of their victimization. Stalking victims suffer from much higher rates of depression, anxiety, insomnia, and social dysfunction than people in the general population. Stalking is a crime under the laws of the 50 states, District of Columbia, U.S. territories, and federal government. Fewer than 1/3 of states, though, classify stalking as a felony in all circumstances, including on the first offense. More than half of states classify stalking as a felony upon the second or subsequent offense, or when the crime involves aggravating factors. Aggravating factors include possession of a deadly weapon, violation of a court order, or condition of probation parole, or if the victim is under 16 years, or the same victim as prior occasions. So, I always have calls to action when it comes to the unsolved cases I share. So what can you do as listeners? What can we do? First, just learn, share, and name it. Call stalking what it is. One of the biggest barriers for victims is that stalking is still minimized and misunderstood. So by learning what legally and clinically constitutes stalking, including the digital and cyber stalking side of things, not just physically following somebody around, that helps to re-educate society. Share accurate information, not just during National Stalking Awareness Month, just all the time. Normalize calling what it is. And push back when you hear society leaning into those cliches, framing stalking behavior as romantic, persistent, just annoying, because language matters. If you are a parent or teacher or aunt or uncle, talk to the teens and young adults in your lives about early warning signs, since stalking often begins with someone the victim already knows. Next, you can support organizations that work directly with victims, either financially or by uplifting their work and sharing their resources. Some of the national organizations to highlight are the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, SPARC, SPARC, Victim Connect, and the National Network to End Domestic Violence. You can also dig into your state's laws and advocate to representatives to tighten them, especially for some of the newer aspects of stalking that are still being ironed out in terms of how to address them, like cyber stalking. And you can advocate for workplace and campus protections. Ask whether your workplace has, or if you're in school, ask if your campus has stalking-specific policies. Advocate for flexible safety accommodations. And encourage places like schools and your workplace to treat stalking as a serious safety issue, not a personal conflict, how it's often framed. And last, and probably most importantly, believe and support victims in their own lives. This is often the most immediate and impactful action, because you can believe victims without demanding proof or minimizing their fear. You can ask if they need help. If you have someone in your life who you know is starting to be on the receiving end of stalking behavior, you can offer to help document incidents if asked and help the victims keep records. Just ask them what they need or how you can help. You can encourage them to connect with advocacy groups, because those are an important first step, even if they aren't ready to report. And just remember and understand when it seems obvious to you that why aren't you just leaving? Why aren't you just getting away? When it comes to the intimate partner violence side of things, remember that that can be something that increases danger for those people. So victims are experts on their own safety, and you just need to defer to them, support them, be an ally, and help them with whatever they need. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review and share about the podcast with your friends and on social media. If you wish to support the show monetarily, I have a Spreaker Supporters Club. It functions a lot like Patreon, and there's a link at the bottom of the show notes below all my source material. Simply click the link, make your account, and once you're logged in, either via the Spreaker app or online, you can listen to all episodes ad-free. I also have a bonus episode in there now, and there are more coming. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again next Monday.